When Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC, he left behind an empire stretching from Greece to India. But what of his family line? Who carried forward his name and who vanished into the shadows of history? In this video, we'll turn our attention to the children that Alexander left behind, legitimate and otherwise, and trace exactly how their lives unfolded, how they came to exercise, or fail to exercise, their inheritance, and ultimately, how their line ended or survived. From intrigue, regents, and pretenders to assassinations and disputed paternity, this is the full story of Alexander's heirs. Let's get started. Today we embark on a journey through one of history's most fascinating dynastic mysteries. Alexander conquered most of the known world by age 30, yet the fate of his children remains largely unknown to most people. Were they destined for greatness like their father? Did any inherit his military genius or political acumen, or were they merely pawns in the ruthless game of succession that followed Alexander's unexpected death? We'll examine each child attributed to Alexander, some legitimate, others disputed, following their individual stories from birth through their ultimate fates. We'll see how the very bloodline that had produced history's greatest conqueror became a liability in the violent world of the successor wars. This is not just a story of royal children, but a window into how quickly empires can crumble when succession is unclear and ambitious men vie for power. In August of 323 BC, just months after Alexander the Great breathed his last in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, his wife Roxana gave birth to a son. The child was immediately proclaimed Alexander IV, heir to the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known. Yet this infant would never rule in any meaningful sense, and his birth came too late to prevent the empire from fragmenting. The timing of Alexander IV's birth was both fortuitous and tragic. Fortuitous because it provided the empire with a legitimate heir from the Argead dynasty that had ruled Macedon for centuries. Tragic because the child arrived in a world already descending into chaos. When Alexander the Great died, he had left no clear succession plan. His generals, known to history as the diadochi, or successors, immediately began maneuvering for power. The empire had been held together by Alexander's personal charisma and military genius, qualities that could not be inherited by an infant. At the time of his birth, the immediate political situation was precarious. Perdiccas, Alexander's chiliarch or second-in-command, had assumed regency over the empire. Philip III, Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother who suffered from some form of mental disability, had been proclaimed king as a placeholder. Now, with the birth of Alexander IV, the empire technically had two kings, one incapable of ruling, and one too young to do so. Ancient sources tell us that Roxana was still in Babylon when she gave birth. The historian Diodorus Siculus records that the birth was greeted with both celebration and anxiety among Alexander's generals. Here was the son they had been hoping for, but also a complication. A living heir meant that none of them could easily claim the throne outright, yet a baby could not command armies or make the crucial decisions an empire required. The infant was immediately recognized as Alexander's legitimate son. Unlike other children who would later be attributed to Alexander, there was no question of Alexander IV's parentage. Roxana had been Alexander's legal wife since 327 BC, married in a ceremony that combined Macedonian and Bactrian customs. The marriage had been part of Alexander's policy of fusion between Greek and Persian cultures, though it had caused some grumbling among traditional Macedonians who preferred their kings to marry within Greek nobility. Alexander IV's childhood was defined by a series of regents who controlled both his person and his theoretical power. The first of these was Perdiccas, who had seized control immediately after Alexander's death. Perdiccas presented himself as protector of the royal bloodline, but like all the successors, he was ultimately pursuing his own ambitions. The infant king became a symbol of legitimacy that various factions sought to control. In 321 BC, when Alexander IV was barely 2 years old, Perdiccas was murdered by his own officers during a failed invasion of Egypt. This left the boy's guardianship in question once again. The new arrangement placed him under the protection of Antipater, the veteran general who had been left in charge of Macedon and Greece while Alexander campaigned in Asia. This meant that young Alexander IV would be taken from Babylon to Macedon, a journey that would bring him closer to the traditional seat of Argead power, but also into a new web of political intrigue. Antipater proved to be a more stable regent than Perdiccas. Under his guardianship, Alexander IV was moved to Pella, the ancient capital of Macedon. Here the child would have been raised in the palace where his father had grown up, surrounded by the symbols and traditions of Macedonian royalty. The historian Justin tells us that Antipater treated the boy with appropriate respect and ensured he received education fitting for a future king. However, this period of relative stability was not to last. When Antipater died in 319 BC, he passed the regency not to his son Cassander, who felt he deserved it, but to Polyperchon, a veteran general whom Antipater judged more capable of protecting the royal family. This decision would have catastrophic consequences for Alexander IV. Cassander was furious at being passed over and immediately began plotting to seize power. The 6-year-old Alexander IV found himself at the center of a civil war. Polyperchon, attempting to legitimize his position, made much of his role as protector of the Argead line. He issued decrees in young Alexander's name and promised to restore the boy to full power once he came of age. However, Cassander proved to be a formidable opponent. In 317 BC, he successfully seized control of much of Macedon and forced Polyperchon to flee with Alexander IV and Roxana to Epirus. The boy's great-grandmother Olympias, Alexander the Great's formidable mother, had been watching these developments from her stronghold in Epirus. Now in her 60s, Olympias remained a force to be reckoned with. She decided to intervene personally in her great-grandson's fate. In 317 BC, she invaded Macedon with an army, claiming to restore Alexander IV to his rightful position. For a brief moment, it seemed the boy might actually exercise real power through his great-grandmother's regency. Olympias initially succeeded in her invasion. She captured and executed Philip III Arrhidaeus and his wife Eurydice, eliminating the rival branch of the royal family. For several months, she ruled Macedon in Alexander IV's name. Ancient sources suggest she may have begun grooming the boy for actual leadership, as he would have been around 8 years old at this time, old enough to begin understanding his heritage and responsibilities. However, Olympias's victory was short-lived. Cassander returned with a larger army in 316 BC and besieged her in Pydna. After a harsh winter siege, Olympias was forced to surrender. She was subsequently executed despite Cassander's promises of safe passage. With Olympias dead, 9-year-old Alexander IV and his mother Roxana fell completely under Cassander's control. Throughout his short life, Alexander IV held the title of King of Macedon, but the reality of his position was far more complex. In the ancient Macedonian system, a king needed to be able to lead armies and make crucial decisions. An infant obviously could not do this, which necessitated the regency system that defined Alexander IV's entire existence. Yet his bloodline gave him a legitimacy that none of the successors could match. The Argead dynasty had ruled Macedon for over 3 centuries by the time of Alexander IV's birth. This was no small matter in a culture that placed enormous value on ancestral legitimacy. The boy was not just Alexander's son. He was the descendant of a line that claimed to trace its ancestry back to Heracles himself. This mythical pedigree, combined with his father's unprecedented achievements, made Alexander IV a powerful symbol even as a child. In 311 BC, when Alexander IV was 12 years old, the major successors signed the Treaty of the Dynasts, which officially recognized him as king and promised that he would assume full power when he came of age. This treaty was signed by Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Antigonus, the 4 most powerful men in the former empire. On paper, it seemed like Alexander IV's future was secure. The treaty stated that Alexander IV would take control of his kingdom when he reached majority, which in Macedonian custom would have been around age 16. Until then, Cassander would continue as regent. The other successors agreed to recognize Alexander IV's legitimacy and to support his eventual rule. For historians, this treaty represents a fascinating moment when the successors officially acknowledged what everyone knew. None of them had the legal right to rule while a legitimate Argead heir lived. However, the treaty was largely a political convenience. By 311 BC, the major successors had essentially carved up Alexander's empire among themselves. Ptolemy controlled Egypt, Seleucus held most of Asia, Lysimachus ruled Thrace, and Antigonus dominated Asia Minor and Syria. Cassander, meanwhile, had consolidated his control over Macedon and much of Greece. None of these men had any real intention of giving up their territories to a teenage king, regardless of his bloodline. Alexander IV's theoretical power was immense. He was, after all, the rightful heir to Alexander's entire empire. In practice, however, he was entirely dependent on Cassander's protection and goodwill. Ancient sources suggest that as the boy grew older, Cassander became increasingly uncomfortable with his presence. A child king was one thing. A teenage king who might actually try to claim his inheritance was quite another. The nature of Alexander IV's upbringing under Cassander's guardianship remains somewhat mysterious. We know he was kept in Amphipolis, a strategically important city in northeastern Macedon, rather than in the traditional capital of Pella. This isolation may have been for his protection, but it also kept him away from potential supporters and from the main currents of Macedonian politics. Some historians speculate that Cassander was deliberately keeping the boy ignorant of his true heritage and power. By 310 BC, as Alexander IV approached his 17th birthday, the situation became increasingly tense. The boy was nearly old enough to claim his inheritance, and there were rumors that some Macedonian nobles were beginning to rally to his cause. The Treaty of the Dynasts had promised him full power, but Cassander showed no signs of preparing to step down. Moreover, the other successors were watching carefully to see what would happen when the legitimate king came of age. Alexander IV's family life was dominated by tragedy and political manipulation. His mother Roxana had been one of Alexander the Great's most important wives, a Bactrian princess whose marriage had cemented Alexander's control over the eastern satrapies. After Alexander's death, she found herself in an impossible position. She was the mother of the rightful king, but she was also a foreigner in a Macedonian court that had never fully accepted Alexander's eastern wives. Roxana's own background made her situation particularly precarious. She was the daughter of Oxyartes, a Bactrian nobleman who had initially resisted Alexander's conquest before becoming one of his most loyal supporters. Her marriage to Alexander in 327 BC had been both a love match. According to ancient sources, Alexander was genuinely smitten with her, and a political alliance. She represented Alexander's vision of a unified Greco-Persian empire, but that vision died with him. Throughout Alexander IV's childhood, Roxana struggled to protect both herself and her son. She had no independent power base and was entirely dependent on whoever held the regency. When Olympias invaded Macedon in 317 BC, Roxana allied with her, seeing the formidable Queen Mother as her best hope for securing her son's future. When Olympias was defeated and killed, Roxana and Alexander IV became prisoners in all but name. Ancient sources tell us little about the personal relationship between mother and son. We can imagine that Roxana worked to keep alive Alexander IV's memory of his father and his understanding of his heritage, but she had to be extremely careful not to appear to be plotting against whichever regent currently held power. The historian Diodorus suggests that she remained devoted to her son's welfare, but she was walking a dangerous tightrope. Alexander IV never married or had children. This is not surprising, given that he died at age 13, but it represents a crucial factor in the extinction of Alexander's direct line. In normal circumstances, a Macedonian prince would have been betrothed by his early teens, with marriage following soon after. The fact that no such arrangements were made for Alexander IV suggests that Cassander had no intention of allowing the boy to reach adulthood and establish his own dynasty. The boy's isolation in Amphipolis meant that he had limited contact with potential allies or supporters. Unlike his father, who had grown up surrounded by the sons of Macedonian nobles who became his companion cavalry, Alexander IV was kept away from the networks of friendship and loyalty that might have supported his eventual rule. This isolation was probably deliberate on Cassander's part. We know nothing of Alexander IV's personality, interests, or capabilities from ancient sources. He remains a shadowy figure, defined more by his bloodline and political significance than by any individual characteristics. This is perhaps inevitable given his youth and the circumstances of his life, but it makes his story particularly tragic. Here was a boy who carried one of history's most famous names, but who was never allowed to develop into his own person. Some historians have speculated about what kind of ruler Alexander IV might have become if he had been allowed to live and rule. Would he have inherited his father's military genius, his charisma, his vision of cultural fusion? These questions can never be answered, but they remind us that Alexander IV's death represented not just the end of a life, but the end of infinite possibilities. In the late summer of 309 BC, when Alexander IV was just 13 years old, Cassander made the decision that would end the Argead dynasty forever. The boy and his mother Roxana were quietly murdered in their residence at Amphipolis. The ancient sources are frustratingly brief about the details, but they are unanimous about the outcome. The last legitimate heir to Alexander the Great was dead. The historian Diodorus Siculus provides the most detailed account, though even he offers few specifics. He tells us that Cassander, having decided that Alexander IV was becoming too dangerous to keep alive, ordered his agents to kill both the boy and his mother. The murders were carried out secretly, and for some time Cassander continued to pretend that Alexander IV was still alive. This deception allowed him to maintain his position as regent while consolidating his own power. The timing of the murder was not coincidental. By 309 BC, Alexander IV was approaching the age when he could legitimately claim full royal power. The Treaty of the Dynasts had promised him his inheritance, and there may have been growing pressure from some quarters of Macedonian society for this promise to be fulfilled. Cassander, who had spent over a decade building his own power base, was not about to surrender control to a teenager with a better claim to the throne. The method of the murders remains unknown. Ancient sources speak only of the deaths occurring secretly or in private. Some modern historians have speculated that poison was used, as this would have been easier to conceal than more violent methods. Others suggest that the victims may have been strangled or suffocated. What is clear is that Cassander wanted their deaths to appear natural, at least initially. The cover-up that followed demonstrates just how politically sensitive these murders were. For months after the killings, Cassander's agents continued to issue decrees in Alexander IV's name. Visitors to Amphipolis were told that the king was ill or otherwise unavailable. This charade allowed Cassander to maintain the fiction that he was still serving as Shea regent for a living king while he worked to legitimize his own rule. When the truth finally emerged, the reaction across the former empire was one of shock and outrage, but by then it was too late for meaningful opposition. Cassander had used the intervening months to consolidate his position and eliminate potential rivals. The other successors, meanwhile, were too busy with their own territorial disputes to intervene on behalf of a dead boy, especially when that boy's death arguably simplified the overall political situation. The murder of Alexander IV marked the end of the Argead dynasty that had ruled Macedon for over 3 centuries. More importantly, for the broader historical narrative, it eliminated the last person with an indisputable claim to Alexander the Great's entire empire. With Alexander IV dead, the fiction that the empire might somehow be reunited under a single legitimate ruler finally ended. The successor kingdoms could now develop without the shadow of a rival claimant hanging over them. Cassander's own position was significantly strengthened by Alexander IV's death, though he still faced the problem of legitimizing his rule. In 305 BC, he officially proclaimed himself King of Macedon, founding what historians call the Antipatrid dynasty. However, his line would not long survive him. His sons proved incapable rulers, and within a generation of Cassander's own death, Macedon would be conquered by another dynasty entirely. The death of Alexander IV represents one of history's great what-ifs. Here was a boy who might have reunited his father's empire, who might have combined his father's military genius with his own innovations, who might have changed the course of ancient history. Instead, he became a victim of the very ambition and ruthlessness that had built the empire he inherited. His death reminds us that in the ancient world, royal blood was as often a death warrant as a path to power. Modern historians assess Alexander IV as a tragic figure whose potential will never be known. He was, in the words of one scholar, a king who never ruled, a conqueror who never conquered, an heir who never inherited. Yet his symbolic importance was immense. As long as he lived, the dream of a reunited Alexandrian empire remained theoretically possible. His death marked the final fragmentation of Alexander's conquests into the separate Hellenistic kingdoms that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean for the next 3 centuries. The location of Alexander IV's tomb, if it ever existed, remains unknown. Unlike his father, whose burial became a matter of intense political competition among the successors, Alexander IV disappeared from history as quietly as he had lived through most of it. This absence of a monumental tomb perhaps reflects the tragedy of his life. He was too important to live, but not important enough in death to merit the kind of magnificent burial that had been accorded to other members of the Argead dynasty. Having traced Alexander IV's brief and tragic life, we now turn to examine another child who claimed descent from Alexander the Great, though his story would prove equally doomed. Around 327 or 326 BC, during Alexander the Great's campaigns in Bactria in the early stages of his Indian expedition, a son was born to Barsine, daughter of the Persian satrap Artabazus. This child would later be called Heracles, and he would represent one of the most controversial aspects of Alexander's legacy. Unlike Alexander IV, whose legitimacy was never questioned, Heracles' very paternity would become a matter of historical debate. Barsine was no ordinary concubine. She came from one of the most prominent Persian noble families and had previously been married to Memnon of Rhodes, the brilliant Greek general who had served the Persian Empire against Alexander's initial invasion. After Memnon's death in 333 BC, Barsine had been captured by Alexander's forces and had become part of his household. Ancient sources suggest that Alexander held her in high regard, not merely as a companion, but as an advisor on Persian customs and politics. The timing of Heracles' birth places it during one of the most complex periods of Alexander's career. In 327 BC, Alexander was dealing with serious resistance in Bactria and was simultaneously planning his invasion of India. This was also the period when Alexander was most actively pursuing his policy of fusion between Greek and Persian cultures, taking Persian wives and encouraging his officers to do the same. The relationship with Barsine fit perfectly into this broader strategy. However, the question of whether Alexander actually acknowledged Heracles as his son remains contentious among ancient sources. The historian Plutarch mentions Heracles but is ambiguous about Alexander's recognition of him. Diodorus Siculus Tomo is similarly unclear. What we can say with confidence is that by the time of Alexander's death in 323 BC, Heracles was known to exist and was understood by at least some people to be Alexander's son, but he was not accorded the same status as the legitimate heir that would soon be born to Roxana. The circumstances of Heracles' birth highlight the complex nature of royal households in the ancient world. Alexander, like most Macedonian kings, had multiple wives and companions. While Roxana was his most important wife from a political standpoint, representing his alliance with the eastern satrapies, Barsine represented his connection to the Persian nobility that he needed to govern his conquests effectively. A son by Barsine would have symbolic value in demonstrating Alexander's integration with Persian aristocracy. Ancient sources suggest that Barsine herself never pushed strongly for recognition of her son during Alexander's lifetime. This restraint may have been political wisdom. Alexander already faced criticism from some Macedonians for his adoption of Persian customs, and another Persian-born heir might have created additional controversy. It's also possible that Alexander himself was ambivalent about the boy's status, preferring to keep his options open regarding succession. The name Heracles itself is significant. In Macedonian tradition, names were not chosen randomly. They carried political and religious meaning. By naming her son Heracles, Barsine, or possibly Alexander himself, was connecting the boy to the mythical ancestor of the Argead dynasty. This was a bold claim that suggested the child was intended to have royal status, even if that status was not immediately formalized. Following Alexander's death in 323 BC, Heracles and his mother Barsine retreated into relative obscurity. While the infant Alexander IV immediately became the center of political attention, Heracles, then about 4 or 5 years old, virtually disappears from the historical record for over a decade. This absence from our sources tells its own story about the complex politics of succession in the early Hellenistic period. Barsine appears to have made a conscious decision to keep herself and her son out of the immediate power struggle that followed Alexander's death. This was probably wise, as the initial focus of the successors was on controlling the legitimate heir and the regency. An illegitimate son with questionable recognition would have been seen as a complication at best and a liability at worst. By maintaining a low profile, Barsine may have hoped to preserve her son's life until political circumstances became more favorable. Ancient sources suggest that mother and son lived somewhere in Asia Minor during these years, possibly under the protection of one of the minor successors or local dynasts. The region was relatively stable compared to the great battlefields of the successor wars, and it had the advantage of being Barsine's homeland, where her family connections might have provided some security. However, we have no detailed accounts of Heracles' upbringing during this crucial period. This obscurity stands in stark contrast to the intensive political attention focused on Alexander IV. While the legitimate heir was being fought over by regents and used as a symbol of royal legitimacy, Heracles was growing up in the shadows. From a historical perspective, this meant that he was developing without the intensive royal education that would normally be given to a potential king. He would have learned to read and write, certainly, and probably received some military training, but he lacked the comprehensive preparation in statecraft and leadership that the Argead princes typically received. The boy's Persian heritage through his mother would have shaped his upbringing in important ways. Unlike Alexander IV, who was being raised in the Macedonian court tradition, Heracles likely grew up with a foot in both Greek and Persian worlds. This bicultural upbringing might have been an advantage in the cosmopolitan Hellenistic world, but it also marked him as different from the traditional Macedonian nobility. During these years of obscurity, Heracles would have been aware of his alleged royal parentage, but he would also have understood that this claim carried significant risks. The fate of other potential claimants to Alexander's inheritance was already becoming clear. They tended to meet violent ends. Barsine may have deliberately kept her son ignorant of the broader political situation, hoping to preserve his innocence and safety for as long as possible. It's worth noting that during this same period, other children connected to Alexander's circle were also facing uncertain fates. The complex web of marriages, alliances, and family relationships that Alexander had created was being systematically dismantled as the successors consolidated their own power. In this context, Heracles' obscurity was probably his greatest protection. The historical silence around Heracles during these years also reflects the limitations of our ancient sources. The major historians of the period, Diodorus, Plutarch, and others, were primarily interested in the main political and military events of the successor wars. A boy living quietly in Asia Minor with his mother would not have warranted much attention unless he became politically active. This historiographical bias means that we know very little about the personal development of most royal children from this period. Heracles emerged from obscurity around 309 or 308 BC, when he was approximately 18 years old. By this time, the political landscape of the former Alexandrian Empire had stabilized somewhat, but new pressures were emerging. Significantly, this was also around the time when Alexander IV was murdered by Cassander, though the exact chronology and whether news of that murder had spread is unclear from our sources. The person who brought Heracles back into the political spotlight was Polyperchon, the veteran Macedonian general who had briefly served as regent for Alexander IV before being displaced by Cassander. By 309 BC, Polyperchon was an aging man whose own political fortunes had declined dramatically. He controlled only a small territory in the Peloponnese and was desperately seeking ways to restore his position against the increasingly powerful Cassander. Polyperchon's decision to champion Heracles represents one of the most interesting might-have-beens of the early Hellenistic period. The old general proclaimed that he would restore the son of Alexander the Great to his rightful position as king of Macedon. Whether Polyperchon genuinely believed in Heracles' legitimacy or was simply using him as a convenient tool for his own ambitions is a matter that ancient sources leave ambiguous. The proclamation of Heracles as king was a direct challenge to Cassander's authority. Even if Heracles was illegitimate, he represented the Argead bloodline and Alexander's legacy in a way that Cassander, son of Antipater and entirely unrelated to the royal family, could never match. In the intensely status-conscious world of Macedonian politics, bloodline mattered enormously, and even a questionable claim to Argead descent was better than no claim at all. Ancient sources suggest that Heracles himself played an active role in this political gambit. Unlike Alexander IV, who had always been a passive symbol manipulated by others, Heracles was old enough to understand the political implications of his position and to participate in planning his own restoration. The young man had spent over a decade in obscurity, but now he was stepping forward to claim what he believed was his birthright. The military campaign that followed was brief but significant. Polyperchon and Heracles gathered a modest army and began moving toward Macedon. Their strategy appears to have been to present Heracles to the Macedonian people as their rightful king and to hope that popular support would offset their military disadvantage. This was not entirely unrealistic. Cassander had never been particularly popular, and there may have been some nostalgia for the Argead dynasty. However, the campaign never reached its intended climax. According to Diodorus Siculus, Cassander recognized the threat that Heracles represented and moved quickly to neutralize it. But rather than risk a military confrontation, Cassander chose a more subtle approach. He entered into negotiations with Polyperchon, offering the old general attractive terms if he would abandon his support for Heracles. The negotiations reveal much about the political dynamics of the period. Cassander offered Polyperchon substantial territories and recognition of his remaining holdings in exchange for eliminating the threat that Heracles represented. For Polyperchon, now in his 70s and commanding a relatively small force, the offer was tempting. A quick profit and security for his remaining years may have seemed more attractive than the uncertain prospects of a civil war. What happened next represents one of the most cynical betrayals in an era known for political treachery. Polyperchon agreed to Cassander's terms, but the price included the elimination of Heracles himself. The young man who had emerged from obscurity with dreams of claiming his father's throne was murdered on the orders of the very man who had championed his cause. Heracles' family background was more complex than that of Alexander IV, reflecting the multicultural nature of Alexander's empire and the intricate web of relationships that the great conqueror had created during his campaigns. His mother Barsine represented one of the most prominent Persian noble families, a connection that would have given Heracles a unique perspective on the empire his father had created. Barsine's family, the Artabazids, had a long history of both cooperation and conflict with the Macedonian monarchy. Her father Artabazus had served as satrap under the Persian Empire, but had also spent time in exile at the Macedonian court during the reign of Philip II, Alexander's father. This meant that Barsine herself would have had some familiarity with Macedonian customs and politics even before her relationship with Alexander began. The relationship between Barsine and Alexander appears to have been more than merely political. Ancient sources suggest that Alexander held her in genuine affection and respect, valuing not only her beauty, but also her intelligence and knowledge of Persian court culture. Unlike some of Alexander's other relationships with Persian women, which were clearly strategic marriages, the connection with Barsine seems to have had a personal dimension. For Heracles, growing up as the son of this distinguished Persian noblewoman would have provided him with a unique cultural education. He would have been bilingual in Greek and Persian from childhood and would have understood both Macedonian military traditions and Persian administrative practices. This multicultural background might have made him particularly well suited to rule over Alexander's diverse empire had circumstances allowed. However, Heracles' mixed heritage was also a potential liability. Traditional Macedonian nobles had never been entirely comfortable with Alexander's policy of cultural fusion, and a half-Persian claimant to the throne might have faced resistance on xenophobic grounds. This tension between cosmopolitan advantage and local prejudice would have been one of the challenges Heracles would have faced had he successfully pressed his claim. Unlike Alexander IV, who was kept in isolation during his brief life, Heracles appears to have had more normal social relationships during his years of obscurity. Ancient sources hint that he may have had companions and advisors drawn from both Greek and Persian backgrounds, though we know few details about these relationships. This broader social network might have been one of his advantages when he finally emerged to press his claim. There is no record of Heracles having a wife or children of his own. Given that he was murdered at around age 18, this is not surprising. In normal circumstances, a young man of royal blood would have been betrothed by this age, with marriage following soon after. The fact that no such arrangements are recorded suggests either that Barsine and her son were too isolated to make appropriate matches, or that they were deliberately keeping their options open for political reasons. The question of what Heracles knew about his alleged father remains intriguing. Alexander had died when Heracles was very young, so the boy would have had no direct memories of him. Everything Heracles knew about Alexander would have come from his mother's accounts, and from the broader cultural memory that was already beginning to mythologize Alexander's achievements. This second-hand relationship with his famous father may have made Heracles' claim feel less real to contemporary observers. The murder of Heracles in 309 or 308 BC represents one of the most cold-blooded betrayals in an era marked by political treachery. The young man who had been proclaimed as the rightful heir to Alexander the Great was killed not by his enemies, but by the very man who had raised him to prominence. Polyperchon's betrayal of Heracles reveals much about the ruthless pragmatism that characterized politics in the early Hellenistic period. According to Diodorus Siculus, the murder was carried out as part of Polyperchon's agreement with Cassander. The old general, faced with the prospect of a difficult military campaign against superior forces, chose to accept Cassander's offer of territory and recognition in exchange for eliminating the threat that Heracles represented. For Polyperchon, it was apparently a simple calculation: the uncertain prospects of supporting a young pretender against the concrete benefits of accommodation with an established ruler. The method of Heracles' murder is not detailed in our sources, but the political circumstances suggest it was carried out quietly and without ceremony. Unlike the death of Alexander IV, which Cassander initially attempted to conceal, there was no particular need for secrecy about Heracles' fate. He had been in rebellion against established authority, and his elimination could be presented as the natural consequence of his failed bid for power. The timing of Heracles' death, so close to the murder of Alexander IV, was probably not coincidental. Cassander was systematically eliminating all potential claimants to Argead legitimacy. With both of Alexander's alleged sons dead, there would be no one left with a credible claim to represent the continuation of the dynasty that had created the empire. This cleared the way for Cassander and the other successors to legitimize their own rule without the constant threat of a rival claimant appearing. From a broader historical perspective, Heracles' death marked another step in the definitive end of Alexander's dynastic legacy. Unlike Alexander IV, whose legitimacy was universally acknowledged, Heracles represented the more ambiguous aspects of succession in the ancient world. His Persian heritage and questionable recognition by Alexander himself made him a less clear-cut heir, but also potentially a more realistic one for ruling over a multicultural empire. The reaction to Heracles' death appears to have been muted compared to the outrage that would later greet news of Alexander IV's murder. This difference in response reflects the uncertainty that had always surrounded Heracles' status. While Alexander IV's death was clearly the murder of a legitimate king, Heracles' fate could be presented as the elimination of a pretender who had overreached his position. Modern historians have debated whether Heracles was actually Alexander's son or whether the entire claim was a later fabrication designed to give legitimacy to political opposition against the established successors. The evidence is ambiguous enough to support either interpretation. Some scholars argue that the Persian cultural context makes Alexander's relationship with Barcine entirely plausible, while others suggest that the claim only emerged when it became politically useful. Regardless of the truth about his paternity, Heracles' brief emergence and rapid elimination illustrate the dangerous nature of royal claims in the post-Alexander period. Even questionable bloodline connections to Alexander were potentially powerful enough to threaten established rulers, but they were also dangerous enough to get their bearers killed. Heracles' story demonstrates how the very legacy of Alexander the Great had become a liability for anyone who might plausibly claim it. The fate of Heracles also reflects the broader transformation of the ancient world from personal monarchy to institutional rule. Alexander's empire had been held together by his personal charisma and the loyalty he inspired in his followers. The successor kingdoms that emerged from the empire's fragmentation were based on more conventional foundations of military power and administrative control. In this new world, bloodline claims were less important than effective governance, and pretenders like Heracles were more nuisance than threat. The absence of any monumental commemoration of Heracles, like the absence of such commemoration for Alexander IV, reflects his marginal status in the historical tradition. Unlike his alleged father, whose death prompted massive funeral preparations and whose burial site became a political prize, Heracles died and was forgotten. This anonymity in death perhaps reflects the tragedy of his life. He was significant enough to be murdered, but not significant enough to be remembered. Having examined the tragic fate of Heracles, we now turn to a third child who appears in some traditions associated with Alexander, though his historical reality remains even more questionable. Among the various traditions surrounding Alexander the Great's family, one of the most intriguing and disputed concerns an unnamed infant son allegedly born to Roxana during Alexander's Indian campaign. According to certain later sources, particularly the Alexander romance and related literary traditions, Roxana gave birth to this child near the Assassines River, modern Chenab, in November 326 BC, during one of the most challenging phases of Alexander's eastern conquests. The Alexander romance, a largely fictional account of Alexander's life that was composed several centuries after his death, presents this birth as occurring during the dramatic crossing of the Indus River system. The text describes Roxana as traveling with Alexander's army despite the difficulties of the campaign, emphasizing her devotion to her husband and her willingness to share in the hardships of conquest. This portrayal fits with the romance's general tendency to dramatize and romanticize events from Alexander's life. According to this tradition, the birth took place during a particularly difficult period of the Indian campaign. Alexander's army had just fought the costly battle against King Porus at the Hydaspes River, and the troops were becoming increasingly reluctant to continue eastward into unknown territories. The birth of a son at this moment would have been seen as an auspicious sign, a divine blessing on Alexander's continued expansion into the mysterious lands beyond the Indus. The geographical setting described in these accounts is specific enough to suggest some basis in historical memory, even if the details have been embellished. The Assassines River was indeed part of Alexander's route during the Indian campaign, and the timing would place the birth during the period when Alexander was consolidating his control over the Punjab region. This specificity has led some modern scholars to wonder whether there might be some historical kernel behind the legend. However, it's crucial to note that this birth is not mentioned by any of the reliable ancient historians who covered Alexander's campaigns. Neither Arrian, who based his account on the memoirs of Alexander's generals, nor Diodorus Siculus, who had access to early sources, makes any reference to such an event. This silence is particularly significant given that both historians were generally attentive to important developments in Alexander's personal life. The absence of this birth from contemporary or near-contemporary sources strongly suggests that it is a later invention. The Alexander romance and related traditions were literary works intended to entertain rather than historical accounts intended to inform. They freely mixed historical facts with fantasy, creating a mythologized version of Alexander's life that bore only loose resemblance to historical reality. The story's emphasis on the Indian setting may reflect the later fascination with the exotic nature of Alexander's eastern conquests. India represented the furthest limits of Alexander's expansion, a mysterious land that captured the imagination of later generations. The idea of a child born in this distant realm would have had romantic appeal for audiences who viewed Alexander's Indian campaign as the pinnacle of his achievements. According to the same later traditions that describe this infant's birth, the child lived for only a short time after birth, dying in India during the continuation of Alexander's campaign. The Alexander romance attributes the death to the harsh conditions of the campaign, suggesting that even the son of the great conqueror could not survive the challenges of expansion into the unknown territories of the East. The alleged brevity of this child's life serves an important literary function in the Romance tradition. It transforms what might have been a succession complication into a tragic illustration of the costs of Alexander's ambition. The death of an innocent infant becomes a symbol of how even the greatest conqueror cannot protect those closest to him from the consequences of his choices. From a historical standpoint, the weakness of the source base for this child makes it impossible to treat him as a genuine historical figure. Modern critical scholarship requires multiple independent sources for major biographical claims, particularly those involving royal succession. The fact that this birth and death appear only in late literary sources that are known to contain fictional elements places the entire story in the category of legend rather than history. This historiographical skepticism does not mean that the story is necessarily false. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as historians often note. It's theoretically possible that Roxana did give birth to a child who died quickly, and that contemporary sources either failed to record the event or that those records have been lost. However, given the high infant mortality rates in the ancient world, particularly under the difficult conditions of a military campaign, such an event might not have seemed historically significant enough to record. The story's survival in later tradition, despite its absence from reliable historical sources, demonstrates how legends about Alexander continued to evolve and multiply long after his death. Each generation seems to have added new elements to his biography, often reflecting contemporary concerns and interests rather than historical facts. The tale of the unnamed infant son fits this pattern perfectly. Some modern scholars have suggested that the story might represent a conflation or confusion of different traditions about Alexander's children. It's possible that later writers, knowing that Alexander had a son named Alexander IV who was born after his death, created an earlier son to add drama to the Indian campaign narrative. This kind of multiplication of legendary elements is common in the development of mythological traditions. The inability to verify this child's existence also highlights the limitations of our knowledge about Alexander's personal life. While we know the broad outlines of his public career and military campaigns, many details of his private relationships and family life remain uncertain. This uncertainty provides fertile ground for the development of legends and speculation. If this unnamed infant existed at all, his family relationships would have been both intimate and tragically brief. As Roxana's son, he would have been connected to one of the most important women in Alexander's life, a princess whose marriage represented Alexander's attempt to create lasting bonds with his eastern subjects. As Alexander's son, he would have carried the bloodline of the Argead dynasty into a new generation, albeit very briefly. Roxana's role as mother would have taken on particular significance during the Indian campaign. Ancient sources consistently portray her as one of Alexander's most important wives, someone who shared not just his bed but also his political vision of a unified empire. The birth of a son during the campaign would have represented the literal embodiment of this vision, a child who was both Macedonian and Bactrian, both European and Asian. The alleged timing of the birth during one of the most challenging phases of Alexander's career would have given the child symbolic importance beyond his brief life. Alexander's army was becoming increasingly reluctant to continue eastward, and there were growing murmurs of discontent among the troops. A son born at this moment might have been seen either as divine approval for the campaign's continuation, or as a hostage to fortune that made further risks unacceptable. Alexander's relationship with this child, if it existed, would have been complicated by the demands of the campaign. Ancient sources consistently show Alexander as devoted to his military objectives above all else, and a newborn infant would have represented both a blessing and a burden during active campaigning. The practical difficulties of protecting and caring for an infant under campaign conditions would have been enormous. The child's mixed heritage would have reflected Alexander's broader policy of cultural fusion. Like Heracles, this infant would have embodied the meeting of Greek and Persian worlds that Alexander was trying to create. However, unlike Heracles, who grew up with a sense of his dual heritage, this child would never have had the opportunity to explore what his bicultural identity might have meant. From a dynastic perspective, an infant son born during the Indian campaign would have represented Alexander's genetic legacy in its purest form, a child conceived and born at the height of his power and ambition. This timing might have given the child particular significance in later legendary traditions, even if his historical reality remains doubtful. The story of Alexander's unnamed infant son, whether historical or legendary, illustrates important aspects of how historical memory develops and changes over time. Even if this child never existed, the story's persistence in later tradition tells us something about what people wanted to believe about Alexander and his legacy. The romantic appeal of a child born and lost during the Indian campaign speaks to later audiences' fascination with the exotic nature of Alexander's eastern conquests. India represented the edge of the known world, a place of mystery and danger where even the greatest of conquerors might face personal tragedy. The story of the infant son adds human drama to what might otherwise be simply a military narrative. From a historiographical perspective, this infant's story demonstrates the challenges that historians face when dealing with legendary material. The line between history and legend is often blurred in ancient sources, particularly when dealing with figures as mythologized as Alexander. Modern scholarship requires careful evaluation of source quality and independent corroboration, standards that this story cannot meet. The fact that reliable ancient historians like Arrian and Diodorus do not mention this birth is particularly significant because both were generally attentive to developments in Alexander's family life. Arrian in particular was careful to record information about Alexander's wives and children. His silence on this matter strongly suggests that the story developed later, perhaps as part of the broader mythologization of Alexander's career. The story also reflects the tendency of later traditions to multiply dramatic elements in historical narratives. The historical Alexander already had a complex family life with multiple wives and at least 2 documented children. The addition of a 3rd child, born and lost in exotic circumstances, adds emotional intensity without requiring major changes to the established historical framework. Despite its questionable historical status, the story of the unnamed infant has had some influence on modern popular understanding of Alexander. Some novelists and filmmakers have incorporated versions of this tale into their works, finding the dramatic possibilities too appealing to ignore. This demonstrates how legendary material can take on a life of its own, independent of historical verification. The persistence of this story also highlights the ongoing human fascination with the personal lives of historical figures. People want to know not just what Alexander conquered, but whom he loved and what children he had. This personal dimension makes historical figures more relatable and human, even when the details cannot be historically verified. For historians studying the Alexander tradition, this unnamed infant represents the kind of material that must be carefully distinguished from more reliable historical evidence. While the story cannot be definitively disproven, it cannot be accepted as historical fact without better documentation. This methodological caution is essential for maintaining the distinction between what we know and what we would like to believe about the past. The alleged extinction of this infant's brief life, regardless of its historical reality, serves as a poignant reminder of the human costs of ancient warfare and expansion. Even if the story is entirely legendary, it reflects real experiences of loss and sacrifice that accompanied Alexander's campaigns. In this sense, the unnamed infant serves as a symbol for all the unnamed victims of ancient conquest. Having examined the questionable tradition of Alexander's unnamed infant son, we can now step back and consider what the stories of all these children tell us about Alexander's legacy and the transformation of the ancient world after his death. As we reach the end of our investigation into the fate of Alexander the Great's children, a stark pattern emerges from the scattered evidence and tangled legends. Alexander IV, the legitimate heir whose bloodline carried the hopes of an empire, was murdered at age 13 in a quiet house in Amphipolis. Heracles, the disputed son whose mixed heritage might have embodied his father's vision of cultural fusion, was betrayed and killed by his own champion. The unnamed infant of legend, if he ever existed at all, disappeared into the mists of campaign hardship and historical uncertainty. This is not the story that the architects of Alexander's empire would have written for themselves. When the great conqueror died in Babylon in 323 BC, his generals and administrators surely imagined that his bloodline would continue, that his children would inherit at least fragments of his vast dominion, that the Argead dynasty would endure to provide legitimacy for whatever political arrangements emerged from the inevitable power struggle. Instead, within 14 years of Alexander's death, every child connected to his name had vanished from the stage of history. The systematic elimination of Alexander's potential heirs was not accidental. It reflected the brutal logic of succession politics in the ancient world, where legitimate claims to power were often more dangerous to their bearers than they were valuable. Alexander IV's murder by Cassander was perhaps inevitable once it became clear that the boy might actually try to claim his inheritance. Heracles' death at the hands of Polyperchon demonstrated that even illegitimate claims could be lethal when they became politically inconvenient. The extinction of Alexander's line was the necessary precondition for the stabilization of the successor kingdoms. Yet this dynastic failure had profound implications that extended far beyond the personal tragedies we have examined. Alexander's empire had been held together by his personal charisma, his military genius, and the loyalty he inspired in his followers. Without a credible heir to inherit these intangible qualities, the empire's fragmentation became inevitable. The death of his children marked the final end of any possibility that the vast territories from Greece to India might be reunited under a single ruler. The political transformation that followed was equally significant. The successor kingdoms that emerged, Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, Antigonid Macedon, and their various rivals, were based on fundamentally different principles than Alexander's personal monarchy. They relied on administrative efficiency, military organization, and diplomatic balance rather than individual charisma and mythical legitimacy. In many ways, they represented a more mature form of political organization than Alexander's intensely personal empire. The extinction of the Argead line also marked the end of a dynasty that had ruled Macedon for over 3 centuries. This was no small matter in a culture that placed enormous value on ancestral continuity. The replacement of the Argeads by new dynasties like Cassander's Antipatrids represented a fundamental break with Macedonian tradition, though it proved to be a temporary one as these replacement dynasties also failed to establish lasting legitimacy. From a cultural perspective, the disappearance of Alexander's children eliminated what might have been fascinating experiments in cross-cultural identity. Both Alexander IV and Heracles carried mixed Greek and Asian heritage that reflected their father's vision of cultural synthesis. Their survival might have produced rulers who could bridge the gap between Hellenic and Persian traditions in ways that the purely Macedonian successors never could. Instead, the Hellenistic world developed along more segregated lines, with Greek and local cultures remaining largely separate. The personal dimension of these tragedies should not be overlooked in our focus on their political and cultural implications. Alexander IV lived his entire brief life as a prisoner in all but name, never experiencing the freedom or agency that his birthright should have provided. Heracles emerged from obscurity only to be betrayed by the man who had promised to restore him. Even the legendary unnamed infant, if he existed at all, knew only the hardships of campaign life before disappearing from history entirely. These personal tragedies also reflect the broader human cost of the transition from Alexander's empire to the Hellenistic kingdoms. The successor wars claimed hundreds of thousands of lives over several generations, destroying cities, displacing populations, and creating political instability that lasted for decades. The children of Alexander were among the most prominent victims of this transformation, but they were far from the only ones. Modern historians have sometimes speculated about alternative histories in which one or more of Alexander's children survived to claim their inheritance. Would Alexander IV have been able to reunite his father's empire? Could Heracles have created a genuinely multicultural monarchy that bridged Greek and Persian traditions? Might the course of ancient history have been fundamentally different if the Argead line had continued? These questions can never be answered, but they remind us that the extinction of Alexander's dynasty was not historically inevitable. Different choices by key figures, Cassander, Polyperchon, even Alexander himself in his failure to arrange for clear succession, might have produced dramatically different outcomes. The murder of children is always a choice, not a necessity, and the choices made by the successors reflected their priorities and values. The absence of surviving heirs also shaped how Alexander himself was remembered by later generations. Without legitimate descendants to preserve and promote his memory, the historical Alexander became increasingly mythologized. The Alexander romance and similar legendary traditions filled the vacuum left by the absence of dynastic continuity. In some sense, the extinction of his bloodline allowed Alexander to become a more universal figure, unconstrained by the limitations and failures that actual descendants might have displayed. The legacy of Alexander's children, or rather, the absence of such legacy, continues to influence our understanding of ancient history. The failure of dynastic succession in this case demonstrates the fragility of personal monarchy and the importance of institutional continuity in maintaining political stability. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from the empire's collapse were in many ways more durable than Alexander's personal dominion, precisely because they were less dependent on individual charisma. In the end, the story of Alexander's children is a story of roads not taken, of possibilities foreclosed by violence and political calculation. Their brief lives and tragic ends illuminate both the achievements and limitations of their father's empire. Alexander conquered most of the known world, but he could not conquer the basic problem of succession that has challenged monarchies throughout history. His children inherited his name and bloodline, but not his empire, or even the chance to try. The heirs of Alexander the Great inherited his name, but not his empire, or at least not the power to keep it. Their story reminds us that in history, as in life, potential is not always realized, and greatness cannot always be passed down through blood. Sometimes the most profound legacies are the ones that never came to be,